With Amazon now taking full creative control of the James Bond franchise after forcing out longtime guardians of the IP Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson from Eon Productions, there is likely to be some momentum for the next James Bond film getting made. The franchise had been in limbo since the release of No Time to Die back in 2021, despite that being filmed in 2019, so there hasn't been a James Bond film for 4 years. And the only other content we got from Amazon relating to the James Bond franchise was the 007 Road to a Million show featuring Brian Cox, and it was almost a reality TV show in which contestants went round the world with a somewhat James Bond theme. Over the last few years, it appeared Barbara Broccoli in particular was very angry at Amazon describing the James Bond franchise as content, and herself and her stepbrother, Michael G. Wilson, seemed to have full creative control and decide the direction in which the James Bond franchise was going to go. Since then, Amazon have now bought out their share of Eon Productions. Whilst they'll still maybe stay on as executive producers, they don't have any more creative control over the franchise. And allegedly, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, was willing to write a blank check in order to get rid of them, and apparently the price was $1 billion. Once Amazon had obtained full creative control of the James Bond franchise, Jeff Bezos took to Instagram and asked fans who they'd like to see be the next James Bond. But more notably, who is going to direct the next film? There is certainly a worry that Amazon is going to run this IP into the ground, as they don't really care about the art form of cinema and just want to produce content for their audiences. However, Amazon may be seeking a great filmmaker to take on the role of reinventing James Bond, and that may come through Christopher Nolan. Now, Christopher Nolan is currently working on an adaptation of Homer's The Odyssey, which is still in production and will be for the next few months and is set for release in 2026. But more information has come out that Christopher Nolan is quite keen to direct a James Bond movie, and he has stated this in the past, stating that On Her Majesty's Secret Service is one of his favourite films of all time, and you can even see the influence of that in the film Inception. Now, there have been reports that Nolan had actually met with Eon Productions back in 2020 after finishing the movie Tenet, and because of this, he wanted to create his own James Bond movie in his own style. However, the clash of the film not getting made came from Eon Productions. Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson did not want to hand Christopher Nolan the full creative control over the movie, which frankly is quite understandable considering they're very protective of the brand and they have been the shepherds of the intellectual property for the last 30 years or so since they took over in the 90s in the Pierce Brosnan era. Nolan would obviously move on from Tenet and go to work at Universal making the film Oppenheimer, which has won him his first Academy Award for Best Directing and Best Film, although he was nominated many times in the past. Now, on this esteem of winning an Academy Award, he may be more willing to go back and experiment and do something that he's always wanted to do, like a James Bond movie. And now that Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson have been removed from the equation, maybe Amazon would be really willing to hand him full creative control over a James Bond movie. Nolan's films seemingly speak for themselves in their quality, and the box office returns for films like The Dark Knight and Inception have really stood out. Even look at Oppenheimer, which almost made $1 billion on a $100 million budget, and considering the content of that film, you didn't think it was going to have widespread appeal in the way that it did. But with that all gone, I think Amazon, if they were willing to pay $1 billion just to seize Eon Productions and they want to have this as the crown jewel of their intellectual properties, maybe they are willing to really throw a great deal of money at Christopher Nolan and get him to work on the project that he has completely envisioned. Now, I do feel that Amazon will be considering this, and unfortunately, they probably want to get this film made as quickly as possible. At the earliest, it could release in 2027, and that would have meant 6 years between the last Bond movie. And that is the longest gap we've had in a James Bond movie since Timothy Dalton's last outing and Pierce Brosnan's first outing. As Amazon don't seem that bothered by money, as they clearly have a lot of it, I feel like they just want to have the IP and milk it for all it's got, and maybe they don't actually have the will or the interest in developing good films and just want it for the content appeal. However, part of me feels like they may entrust someone like Christopher Nolan to direct the first film and maybe even give him a shot at doing a second movie in the franchise and give him the full creative control that he would ask for. And they may even hold up on doing spin-offs set in the world that Christopher Nolan is going to create, and they may actually develop other spin-off content from the Daniel Craig era. Many people are asking about a Moneypenny spin-off. That was apparently something mentioned in a meeting with Barbara Broccoli. She was allegedly really annoyed about that, as she didn't want the IP milked for content. Although this could be a way for them to really focus on crafting a great film franchise while still making money off the intellectual property that is the James Bond universe. Now, many people have stated that Christopher Nolan may want to make a period piece with James Bond and set it in the 50s or the 60s, and I could really see this happening, although I don't know where this information has necessarily come from. Christopher Nolan did make Tenet, which is set in the modern day, and he has done more contemporary movies rather than just like historic period pieces. However, the fact that he stated that On Her Majesty's Secret Service is one of his favourite films of all time, I feel like he would likely want to set the film in the 1960s, for example. And if that is the case, they are probably going to have to spend a lot more money. The James Bond franchise over the years has relied a lot on product placement, and making a period piece set 50 years ago or so is going to be a lot more expensive, as you're going to have to craft sets and use vehicles that were appropriate for the time. Whereas, like, when these films were shot at the time, they were just using what they could get on the day. It was obviously a lot cheaper to shoot a James Bond film modern day in the modern day rather than just do a period piece. But I feel like Amazon may really get behind some sort of vision from Christopher Nolan, and this is something that he seemingly wants to do. And, he's only in his 50s as a director and has got lots of years ahead of him, and he may want to finally dabble into another franchise, having worked on Batman and the Dark Knight trilogy. Nolan has constantly said that he would do a James Bond film, but obviously it has to be right for him. Had he been earlier in his career when he spoke with Eon Productions, he may have got the gig of directing a James Bond movie with Daniel Craig. And I remember at the time when Spectre was being developed, they considered hiring Christopher Nolan to direct the next James Bond movie. I don't know whether that's true or not, and that could be speculation. And with the reports that Henry Cavill is still one of the top picks for fans to play James Bond, despite being in his early 40s. He did audition for James Bond for Casino Royale, and recently that the audition tape has leaked online. And considering Christopher Nolan does know Henry Cavill, as they worked on Man of Steel together, Nolan did write that film and was an executive producer. And allegedly, Henry Cavill did audition for Batman in Batman Begins, and Henry Cavill seems to work really well as a spy in the 1960s. You just have to look at the film The Man from U.N.C.L.E. So that could be the way this franchise is going in the next few years. I feel like Nolan probably would want a bit more time. In recent years, he has had 3-year gaps between the films he is releasing, and pushing him to come off the Odyssey, which is still filming and then isn't released till next year, and starting on a big project like James Bond is probably too much for him. So he could end up shooting this film in 2027 for a 2028 release, and that will be quite a long time to wait for James Bond movies. But if you want to have the quality of Christopher Nolan crafting this film, Amazon are going to have to tolerate that, and they can milk the IP in other forms on their streaming service if they choose to make up for the shortfall of that time. I still have no idea whether or not Christopher Nolan would be interested in directing this film. I feel that he was quite angry with Warner Brothers when they did the streaming and film release at the same time for Tenet, and that led him to move to Universal. And Nolan may now have contractual obligations to Universal rather than going off to work at Amazon. However, Nolan is a big enough director who seems to have so much esteem around him. I feel like he could command the respect of both Universal and Amazon and be able to work with both studios to create these projects going into the future. We'll have to wait and see what happens over the next few months. I feel like we won't get any concrete information if Nolan would direct this film until after The Odyssey has finished, so probably not until early 2026. Most likely, I don't think Amazon are going to want to wait that long before going into production on another James Bond movie, so they'll probably shop around writers and directors and try and get something out for 2027 at the earliest. Potentially, they could get something out for next year, but I feel like they won't rush this other than to aim for a 2027 release date. I feel like a film that's not even materialized yet that could be filmed this year and released next year is a bit much, and I don't think Amazon would be willing to do that, but I could be wrong. Do let me know if you think Christopher Nolan should direct the next James Bond movie for Amazon and whether or not he would get full creative control. I personally feel like he would only agree to it if he did get that full creative control, but most likely they're going to hire some other director, and there are plenty of other directors who could helm a James Bond project. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Please give this video a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and make sure to click the bell icon to receive notifications for all of my future videos. That's it for now. Thanks for tuning in.